Hi, my name is Dr. Suanne Gibson, and I am an Associate Professor of Inclusive Education here at Plymouth University. It's given me great pleasure to be presenting on my research and my pedagogy and also some of my knowledge exchange work with you today. And I hope that it will go some way to informing your work, your thinking, your practices in the area of higher education and widening participation, with particular reference to inclusive provision for our disabled students, but with looking at the wider context in terms of other intersections as well. I know that this week is very much looking at the intersectionality question around inclusion, and I'm hoping that what you'll hear from me in this session will help to inform your thoughts and hopefully raise some questions and provide some additional insights into your world of practice in the field of disability. At the end of my presentation, I will be giving you some contact details, my email address, my Twitter handle, and also my LinkedIn profile. So I'd be very happy if any of you would like to follow up with communications or to get in touch. And I'm sure that the colleagues at the National Association of Disability Practitioners will be also making available my slides. So I thank you to them again for inviting me to come along and speak with you today. Okay, I'm just going to share my slides now. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see that. Just by way of a quick introduction, obviously there was a blurb sent out, an overview really as to what I was going to present today. Just for those of you who perhaps haven't read it, or for those of you who have and would like a quick recap, just to give you an insight into my background. So a key focus of my work is very much to reposition how disability is traditionally considered in higher education, actually in education in general, because I also do a lot of work in mainstream secondary schools here in Plymouth and internationally around the question of inclusion. So it's about repositioning how we traditionally consider disability. Disability for many, many decades, well, more than decades, one might say, has been positioned as a pejorative, as a negative, very much viewed through the medical model, the medical lens. Now, much has moved forward over the years, and we have widening participation, and we have the Equality Act, and we have lots of legislation, but we still have a lot of ineffective provision and practice that are not really akin to what I and many of you will understand as being inclusive education and inclusive practice. So in this presentation, I'm hoping to give you insight into how we can go about disrupting hegemonic beliefs and practices in education, and ideally work towards empowering our disabled students as core educators of and for inclusion. Now, I very much see my disabled students and other disabled students nationally and internationally, those that I've worked with, as being key educators for what we do in education. We need to empower those voices, engage with those voices, learn from those individuals, and move our practices forward in that way or in that fashion. And also then in this presentation, I'm going to be enabling you to engage with the concept and experience of disability as one part of a much more complex whole when it comes to understanding and then considering individual identity and impact. And obviously, I'm referring here again to intersectionality, which, as we know, refers to the various components that make us who we are, whether that be our gender, our social class, our age, our race or our ethnicity, our disability, our family status, our social class background, and also our sexuality. And I'm referring here to LGBTQ as well in this work. So certain intersections we know from research can be and are linked to the experience and impact of disadvantage and exclusion, resulting in socially and economically challenging life circumstances. So when we are considering the experiences and the need for equitable education provision, we do our disabled students a disservice if we fail to include, I would argue, those other elements of their life or identity, which may further compound the challenges they face in relation to their disability or in relation to accessing effective inclusive education. I'm going to refer to a student by the name of Nolan here, whose work I cite in the paper. He speaks very strongly, and he reflects on being, in his words, a Black and disabled student during the age of COVID-19. And he argues that the individual level barriers of a white male will be different than those of a Black woman, even if they have similar disabilities or chronic illnesses. So again, this point that we really need to engage with the various dimensions that make our students and each other, I would argue, the whole of who we are, all the bits that make us who we are. So those intersections, very, very important, really. Okay. So that's just a little overview really from the blurb that would have been sent out to give you a flavour or a taster of my paper today. And I think having provided you with that insight, I think there are three key points, three key messages really that I want to get through in my talk with you today, and I hope they come across clearly. And that is firstly that I think widening participation has failed. I think as a discourse, it has pushed forward in terms of a variety of legislation and policy, which we're going to look at shortly. It has pushed forward in terms of a lot of diverse forms of provision, but we still have a situation where we don't have the numbers of students who come to our universities from diverse backgrounds are not reflective of their population as a whole. So they are still underrepresented. And we know that for many of our diverse students, whether they are being positioned by the system as diverse because of disability, because of ethnicity, because of sexuality, for whatever reason, they are still being failed in terms of the actual so-called inclusive experiences and processes that they go through in order to access what is equitably and rightfully resource-wise for them to support in terms of providing more inclusive provision. So I would argue that widening participation has yet to achieve its end game, has not realised its full focus. The policies are there, the practice in some contexts is there, but we still are not being fully inclusive for all of our students. So WP as a policy needs to be, I would suggest, reconsidered. The second message, or the second insight I would really like for you to garner or to gain from this today is the lessons that we have learned with and from our students during the pandemic. What have our students, our disabled students and our students in general, what have they told us about how the pandemic has been for them? What changes in practice have been equitable and inclusive in terms of their provision? And what can we take forward really from those lessons in terms of continuing to be more fully inclusive in our provision? So the 3 points: widening participation has yet to be fully achieved. What have we learned from the pandemic? And thirdly, what do we need to take forward in terms of being more fully inclusive in our provision for our students? Okay, so I've spoken a little bit already about widening participation and equality of access. I think by way of just giving you a little bit of insight into my experience and my background, my work has spanned the last 20 years in higher education, and I have taught many students, undergraduates and or postgraduates. My research spans the field of secondary education, special educational needs. It looks at critical pedagogy in higher education. And it also then looks at issues around intersectionality, and I also pick up on theory and policy. I've been working closely with various organisations over the last few years, and I think particularly over the pandemic, things have evolved quite a bit in relation to my work with the House of Lords, my work with ALFI, the Alliance for Inclusive Education, my work also with the National Association of Disability Practitioners, and my work with organisations here at Plymouth City Council and with schools. And I think what I'm seeing increasingly is a sense that inequality is becoming more pronounced in many areas of our society. So when we talk about widening participation and equity of access, I would argue that a lot of my my experience and my expertise would suggest we have a long way to go. We have come so far in terms of policy, but the reality is that for many of our students, they are not experiencing full access, they are not experiencing inclusion, and we do not have equity really in terms of our provision yet for all of our students. So what do we need to do about it? We know when we talk about intersectionalities, when we talk about widening participation, we are generally speaking about these particular groups of students. Students who might be considered to come from lower socioeconomic groups, mature students, part-time learners, learners from ethnic minority groups, work-based vocational learners, disabled learners, care leavers, and or first in the family. And we know, as I've said earlier, we've had a lot of policy development over the last 20 odd years, I would suggest, around the context of widening participation and inclusion. And yet we are still living in a time where exclusion continues, where many of these particular groups of our students are being ostracized from education, and where poverty is very much on the increase in this country and globally. We just need to turn on the news any time during the day to get an insight as to how that's impacting on so many of our community across the globe and nationally. And of course, that then has an impact in terms of our students being able to access higher education and to move forward with their lives. So the contemporary education policy scene, national priorities, relevant bodies plus voices. I think, again, my point here is that we may very much feel that we have come forward significantly in the sector with regards our policies, with regards our provisions, but yet for many of our young students, particularly those who come from diverse backgrounds, the research is suggesting, as Nolan's work has done here in 2021, research that I've carried out and research that others have carried out in the field, that for many of our positioned diverse students, they experience a lot of frustration. They experience dropout and transition from programs across different universities to try and find the right fit for them. And they are experiencing failure. And really, that's not good enough. It's not equality, it's not inclusive provision. So how do we move forward with that? How do we enable our sector to address what the needs actually really are? Just drawing on some of my own research over the last 10, 20 years, some work that I did with colleagues in Cyprus and in America and in New Zealand, where we were working with diverse students. So these were students who may have had and had disclosed a disability. They were also students who came from other widening participation backgrounds, perhaps diverse ethnic backgrounds, were mature students. So again, it's looking at these different intersections. And what the research was highlighting is that the exclusive experiences for one of our student groups, whether that was a disabled student, could be quite similar to the kinds of exclusionary experiences of some of the other students. And one of the issues was to do with bureaucracy and the need to constantly have to fill in forms, to communicate, to recommunicate, to chase people. One of the citations here, I should not have to send 10 emails and go to the welfare department many times in order to be assisted. And then also the issue of actually not knowing their rights, and therefore how do we go about asking for them? So many students coming to university not knowing what they have the right to access, whether that's additional funding or other forms of support through their personal tutor or the university in general through student services, for example. So again, this issue that, as we know, knowledge is power. How do we make sure that our young people or our older people, our students in general, have got access to that information before they start at their university? Student counselling and doctors, disability assists seem really disconnected. You're going through one and the other and the other. You have to gather all the evidence. So again, there's that issue of bureaucracy and the need to gather evidence. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. Okay. So student counselling and doctors' disabilities seem really disconnected. So again, just going back to that point I made earlier in relation to bureaucracy and the fact that many of our students are having to chase emails, chase paperwork, fill out many forms. And of course, that can delay getting access to what is rightfully theirs in terms of resource provision. So I think that's something we need to think about going forward. So when we think about widening participation, equality of access and inclusion and diversity, I think we also must consider issues around poverty. We know that the number of our disadvantaged children and young people in the UK has very much been compounded by COVID-19, which obviously began as a global pandemic back in December 2019. The impact of the pandemic in the UK since our initial lockdown has been reported in the Department for Education Commission research of 2022 as large differences in progress among pupils, disparities in pupils' social, emotional and academic progress, excuse me, along with pupils having increasingly complex and variable needs. So pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds who did not attend school or engage well online during homeschooling seem to have been most profoundly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, that then has an impact in terms of transition on to further education or higher education. So again, I'm bringing in this point around poverty, because I think that's something that we do need to consider. We know that a lot of our students, our mature students and our other students really struggle in terms of resource provision, in terms of capital, accessing capital to enable them to get through their studies. And I see that as becoming an increasing situation in this world and this society in which we are living. We just need to look at the news again in terms of the increasing need and use of food banks, etc. And I think it says it all. Further research that was conducted by EPI in 2022, looking at disadvantage gaps in England, and they've argued that the gap between the educational outcomes of disadvantaged and vulnerable students, and we know that that links to students in relation to diversity or widening participation, so the gap between these students and the rest of the student population is one of the greatest challenges facing our education system and arguably our society in England. Let's hang on to that point, because I think it's something we need to be bringing into conversation with our colleagues, with senior managers, with middle managers, really in terms of thinking about the way in which we provide for and understand the sorts of situations and backgrounds that many of our students are coming from as they are working towards and struggling to access higher education. That narrative is really important to get a handle on. And we can only do that by growing and building trusting relationships with our students and knowing them as human beings in all that that is. Another piece of research carried out by the Nuffield Foundation in 2021 has argued that the outbreak of COVID-19 and its health, economic and social consequences has had profound implications for all young children, but especially those growing up in low-income families and those whose parents have lost their jobs or have faced rising costs during the lockdown. So again, just really trying to make that point that we may be working to include students that we are aware have disclosed a disability, and that might entail considering more diverse or more inclusive rather forms of teaching tools. But I think we also need to think about the other aspects of their identity that may be contributing to some exclusionary experiences that they have had prior to, in transition to, and during higher education. I think social class poverty is definitely one of those points. So I think we need to really get a handle on that as a sector, and I don't believe we've got there just yet. Now, since the Second World War, government policy in the UK and subsequently mainstream schooling structures and practices have emphasised two core priorities. The firstly, to rebuild and enhance our economy, making the UK a market leader on the global scale, the global stage. And secondly, and I would argue more importantly from my position, to achieve social equality via welfare reform rooted in the development of an education offer that enables all to succeed and all to flourish. The challenge that the UK faces, and which is also experienced in other countries, is that policies only articulate what needs to be done. They remain unclear about how it should be done. So the policies articulate what needs to happen, what should happen. We know, for example, with SENDA 2001, the Equality Act, the Discrimination Act, the Disability Equality Duty Act, they've all come out with very key, well-considered positions on what needs to happen to achieve fully inclusive, fully equal access and provision for all of our diverse students in all of their, considering all of their intersectional contexts and or identities. That's great, but it's unclear as to how it should be done. Now, from my perspective and in terms of my research, I would argue that how we need to be evolving and developing our practices, we need to be engaging, as I said already, our student voices as core in those conversations. So whilst we're emerging from this pandemic with a sense of what should be happening and how and what our government is actually telling us with various national and local directives, such as building back better, levelling up, we don't have a sense yet fully as to how we can make these policies actually be fully implemented to achieve what they're aiming to achieve. And if we don't get moving on that, then I think we're going to look at a situation where the poor will continue to get poorer and the smaller number of those that are particularly rich and have a lot of cultural capital in our society will continue to grow that. Now, the Office for Students' recent policies that they have published, and also the work of John Blake, talks very strongly about how universities need to work more closely and empower their local communities. Now, I think that's seminal. And I think I come back to that point again about the need to build relationships, to understand and to get to know our students, to get to know our communities, and to let those voices and those insights empower and provide insight into the ways in which we practice, enable us to be more inclusive in our provision. What can we learn from each other, rather than assuming that the top-down policy always has it right. It will suggest what needs to be done, and we may agree with the view, we might have the same position ethically and theoretically, but in terms of practically making it work, I think that's when we need to actually be engaging in those critical conversations with the actual users of the system, i.e. our students, and getting a sense of and a handle around their backgrounds and all that makes up their diversity. Just on that, I want to, if you're not already aware of the work of Judy Heumann, I just want to introduce you to her world. She talks about, again, the need to speak up and out. Now, this connects to one of my particular views and positions on the importance of academics and practitioners in the world of disability as also being activists in what they do. So it's about speaking up and out, empowering those diverse voices, acting on what those diverse voices have to share in terms of new knowledge, insight, and suggestions for ways forward. So let's just listen to what Judy has to say about her experiences with regards to inclusion and exclusion. I'm hoping you're actually seeing the video now as it's coming up, but if you don't, then please have a look at the link that's on the PowerPoint. Okay, so that short piece from Judy Heumann was covered in that news report, really talks about the need to speak up and speak out. And you'll see that in that news report, the reporter talks about what we've learned from a lot of our different diverse groups within society who've been pushing for equality and human rights, whether that's to do with those who are working for equality in terms of sexuality, the gay pride movement, also those who are pushing forward for rights with Black Lives Matters movement, and also speaking up in terms of gender with the Me Too movement. So a lot of activism happening across the world at the minute. And I think we can really learn from Judy's story about how she experienced exclusion as a young child when her mother tried to bring her to a mainstream education school for her to have her primary education, assuming because she's a wheelchair user, that should not be a barrier. However, as she explored in the story with the news reporter, it very much was a barrier. So I think she speaks very clearly about the need for allyship, the need to understand, the need to build relationship, and ultimately to speak up and to speak out and to be active in the ways in which we take a stand against inappropriate, unequal, unfair and discriminatory practices that do not provide for inclusive provision. So how has the pandemic impacted on practices? So the first point I was wanting to raise with you in terms of my 3 points, I think I've done that, and that's really looking at what widening participation is, how it impacts in terms of policy and provision in relation to disability and other intersections, and how as a practice it has still failed to be fully inclusive in terms of its provision, and giving you a little bit of a flavour of how we can move forward, learning from the voices and the views of individuals like Judy Human, and also the students whose citations I noted earlier. So that's the first point. The second point, and we're going to be looking at that now, is really what can we learn from the pandemic? How has the pandemic impacted on practices and cultures? Now, there are two key studies that I want to refer to here. One is a national study by my colleagues, my colleague Meta Westander, who is the CEO of Disabled Students UK. Now, they conducted a national study with disabled students, looking to access their insights and experiences of inclusive provision in higher education during the pandemic. Alongside that, DS UK worked alongside myself and also colleagues at Wolverhampton University, where we conducted a pilot project. Ultimately, the feedback we had from our pilot project very much reflected the key points that came out of the national study with DS UK. And these are some of the main themes that emerged. I'm just going to walk you through them. Funding financial disparities, problems with accessibility to the environment and equipment, plus support. Administrative burden. That goes back to the point I made earlier in terms, and also raised by one of the students in my study a number of years ago, around bureaucracy and form filling and having to chase people via emails or phone calls and going to different offices to try and get a decision on a resource or whatever it might be. Well-being, inequality, social gap, sense of belonging, being othered, housing and accommodation challenges. And these are some citations from the pilot study I did, highlighting and really stemming from the voices of our disabled students, speaking about the barriers they experienced during the pandemic. Again, what have we learned? So initially, this student has noted the university would not accommodate my reasonable adjustments. This changed when I raised a complaint. However, I've since had to defer until January 22 as my Student Finance England made errors with my DSA provision. So this is looking again now in terms of policy provision around disabled students allowance. And I'll be picking up on that on the next slide. But just to note that there are some revisions taking place to that policy, and that stems from work that Lord Chris Holmes has been doing over the last year. I've been involved in that research with him, and that's looking at really how policy is failing our disabled students, how the Disability Student Allowance provision is failing those students, and what recommendations need to be taken on board for more effective provision. So I'm going to recommend a link to this work as we go through into the next slide shortly. Another example of exclusive provision here, supervisors and tutors, example of inclusive provision, supervisors and tutors being incredibly supportive, but getting relevant permissions always involve bureaucratic hassles. So again, the bureaucratic issues, the challenges in relation to who do I speak to, who do I email, which forms do I fill out, who needs to sign it, etc. How can we make that much more efficient in our provision? DS UK's research again came up with 6 lessons around taking an anticipatory approach and resourcing staff. Now, they had 326 respondents from 69 higher education providers across the UK, and the research provided some really rich data. And they found that just 23.1% of disabled students were receiving the support they needed over the pandemic, with many saying they felt left behind, alienated and forgotten. Now, that is not the kind of experience I think any of us want for any of our students once they've made a commitment to, invested in, and see themselves as being a part of a university geographical space, a university learning experience to enable them to move forward in terms of their career, which ultimately will have a positive impact in our wider society. None of us want to hear any of our students saying that they feel left behind, alienated or forgotten. So what do we need to do in order to respond to that? Now, Meta and her team within DSU came out with 6 lessons. So, and I think that these lessons very much reflect the main themes that came out of our pilot study. So where we have issues around financial disparities and inequality with regards to inaccessibility to the environment and equipment, we need to be taking an anticipatory approach. Now, a lot of this stems takes us right back to 2000 with the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act, in that we have got an anticipatory duty and it's enshrined in the law. So this really should have been happening already. So we need to take that on board and realise that we are not being fully anticipatory in our provision, and we are not being fully compliant really in terms of our legal requirements as a sector, I would argue. And hence we need to be listening to our students and taking on more effective provision and practice. So research by Nolan, who I mentioned earlier, and also Hector, are arguing that pandemic-induced practices have resulted in more equality for many students, whilst at the same time causing further unjust forms of provision. And we know from research that's come out recently from the Disabled Students Commission, a nice significant research report in 2022, the key themes that they're arguing for is for more effective communication, being more consistent in our provision, so that if a student goes to one class and is receiving their lecture notes in advance, they're getting the same sort of provision in another module. So it's about being consistent, it's about offering choice, and also about being certain. So when we can say to our students at an open day, yes, you will receive additional support. Yes, there is funding for this. Yes, we do have accessible teaching and learning, that we actually ensure that we are fully responsive to those messages in terms of the actual provision that the students then do receive when they come to university. I've already cited this point from Nolan earlier, but I think it speaks very loudly. To me it does, because again, it's making that connection around the intersection point, or the intersectionality point. So even if some of our students have similar disabilities, and even if they have a similar disability, that doesn't mean because one student has MS and another student has MS, that it's the same sort of provision that each of them will need. It's not. It's very much got to be weighted on an individual situation and an individual report. And then the issue here also being made that because we have, for example, as Nolan says, the individual level barriers of a white male will be different than those of a black woman, even if they have similar disabilities. So again, that point that we take on board the other aspect of their identity, really considering those various intersectional elements. So that's really the second point then. So the first one, that widening participation has failed to date in my view, and why has it failed to date? So we've looked at that. The second point, what have we learned from our students during the pandemic? And this third point we're going to cover now, what do we need to do to take those insights forward? Okay, so I would suggest that practices therefore need to begin with having conversations. We need to be having conversations with students, listening to those students and understanding what they really need, and acknowledge and acting upon that. Now that's a citation that's come out of our pilot study with DS UK. Disability student support services need to be more accessible and consistent in their communications. Now we have developed a series of quite new forms of provision and proactive forms of provision within our university student services, making sure that all of our students who disclose a disability have got mentoring provision set up straight away in advance of any disability student allowance funding coming through, because we know there is a break and a barrier in terms of time from when a student discloses a disability to actually accessing the funding once they've gone through the various rigmaroles in terms of application forms. That's all going back to Student Finance England, etc. So in terms of speeding that up and filling the gap, at the University of Plymouth, we have a mentoring system set up in advance. We've got that provision already in place before the funding comes through. Of course, not all universities have that, but we know that it's something that's come back from the DS UK work as being a good form of inclusive practice. So it's about reaching out to our students and understanding what their individual requirements would be. We've become much more equipped to deliver online. So the argument then very much is, well, let's continue to do that where we can. So if we are recording our lectures, let's continue to record our lectures. If we are providing hybrid, let's continue to provide hybrid where and when it is possible to do so. Yes, there is a lot of arguments to be made around the importance of one-to-one, and the benefit of learning in that context. We also know that for some of our disabled students, the benefit of having more readily available access online has enabled them, particularly those who struggle with fatigue, to access their learning at a time more conducive to fit with their needs. It's about being compassionate, being proactive in terms of our consultation, being aware about mental health and hidden disability. This sense of community and compassion. I think there was a real significant development around compassion in terms of how we work with each other, both as colleagues and our students. And I, for one, am hoping that many of us will hang on to that and bring that, continue that in terms of the way in which we work with our face-to-face delivery as well. So empowering our disabled students, giving access to their voices, and also giving them priority in terms of when we consider other intersections as well. And as I've mentioned earlier, I think academic can also mean activist. We need to arguably reimagine what it means to be an inclusive academic today. I think between the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, the LGBT equality movement, all of these matters are core in terms of the wider debate around a socially equal and inclusive higher education provision, including all of our students, regardless of what their identity may or may not be. So my view is that we need to be having these, what may be for some challenging conversations, because from my position, I think if we consider ourselves to be inclusive educators, we are political. To be an inclusive educator is to be a political educator, because to be an inclusive educator is someone who is pushing against the general flow. And that connects to the work of Sarah Ahmed, who talks about the fact that in her research, many of her widening participation practitioners or practitioners in higher education working for equality find themselves being very challenged daily by ways in which things are done and the way in which diversity can be positioned and repositioned in ways that continue to discriminate and oppress. So if you are an inclusive educator, you are a political educator, I would suggest. And in that case, there may well be an activist within you, if not there already. And in terms of how we work and how we co-create change within our various institutions, I think that can't be done in isolation. No person is an island. For me and my work, a lot of the significant outputs that I've had over the years have always been those outputs that have been done in collaboration. So I'm very much one that would argue if we're going to push for equality and for systemic change, we need to be working in partnership with others. We need to be utilising critical forms of pedagogy as opposed to what Paulo Freire would refer to as your traditional banking form of learning. We need to be working in collaboration. We need to be engaging with the wider public, and that links to the point I made earlier about the Office for Students, where there is an argument being made now that universities really do need to be working more effectively and readily in terms of outreach and working in their communities. And that comes into the issue around post-16 as well. And of course, we know that in that whole area, many of our young people who have special education needs disability are being failed within our mainstream secondary system. And that then results in a failure for us to enable those young people to effectively progress on to higher education and to move on forward in terms of their achievement and their progression. So we need to be having those conversations, I would suggest, with the wider public within our university campuses and environment. And that links in then to practices around knowledge exchange, where we actually get our students working alongside us in various projects within our wider community. Now, to give you some examples of the sorts of work that I'm doing that I think speaks to a lot of the points I've just made in this last slide, I recently developed a programme with a student of mine and our careers and employability provision here at University of Plymouth called Opportunity Plymouth. And that's working with young people who find themselves in challenging circumstances. Now, those may be young people who have or are considered within their school as having special education needs disability. They may be young people from Black minority ethnic groups. They may be young people who are coming from a challenging background in terms of poverty. But this particular model of provision is where we have trained some of our students to become mentors, and they work alongside those young people for an intense 6-week period, looking at their post-16 destinations, helping them to consider what opportunities are there for them in terms of scholarships, in terms of further education, in terms of work-based experiences, in terms of A-levels or GNVQs or whatever it may be. So it's really helping those young people to see that there are opportunities that they may not necessarily feel prior to the mentoring that they receive, that they had the right to access. So it's about really trying to break down those ingrained barriers that I think culturally exist in many of our communities across the UK. So that's one example. Another example of work that I'm doing is in partnership with Plymouth City Council, Plymouth Education Board, and my colleagues at Marjon Plymouth University. So we have two universities here in Plymouth, Plymouth University and Marjon University. And that research and work is working with Key Stage 3 young people in secondary school, and working with families and school leaders and teachers around the question, are we included? So again, it's tapping into issues around disability, special needs, but also some of those other aspects of intersectionality, identity, where exclusion and oppression and failure can be quite a dominant part of the narrative. So what do we need to do to shift that? How can we best support those communities in moving forward? So that point again, I'm just trying to make it clear that in terms of the third message in my presentation today, what do we do to make change happen? What do we do to build back better? What do we do to create a more equal, effective, inclusive system? I think we can't do it in isolation. It's got to be in collaboration. I think if we position ourselves as inclusive educators, we are political educators, and in that sense, we are arguably also activists. So that's my third key point, really, that I wanted to get across to you today. So nothing about us without us. I have an article coming out in September that was written in collaboration with some of my disabled students and also my colleagues at Reading University and their disabled students. And myself and my colleague also, we position ourselves in relation to our own disabilities as people who have experienced exclusion and oppression in relation to working through and with a system that doesn't understand, that doesn't perhaps listen at times, and that doesn't grasp really what needs to shift in order for full inclusion to be provided. So we have a paper coming out, and that's with a journal of innovation, international journal, and I'll be tweeting about that in September. As I said, if you would like to follow me, I'll be giving you my contact details shortly. I had an article published in Teaching Times around the research I'm doing with Marjons and the question, are we included in secondary education? And as I've mentioned earlier, or maybe I didn't, I'm doing a piece with other colleagues, and that's going to be a part of the BERA, British Educational Research Association blog, and that will be coming out over the next academic year, where we'll be hearing from a variety of key individuals and practitioners in the world of disability rights in higher education. So again, if you want to follow, please do so. That's my email, my Twitter, my LinkedIn. I'd love to get in touch with anyone who's got an interest in this. For me, what I think is a very important core area of provision in education. I think if we can get this right, if we can provide a more equitable, fair, inclusive education system for all of our students, we all win. Our society wins, our economy wins, we all win. And isn't that what we all want? So I think on that note, I will wrap this up. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the rest of the conference over the last few days, and I look forward to hearing from some of you over the next while. Do get in touch. Thank you.